Miss Richards, our first witness wishes to be known as Alison, does she?
That's right.
Alison, please.
Please state your full name
Alison Maxwell Bennett.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Alison, you're here to talk about your son, Alistair,
That's right.
and your daughter, Joanne, sits beside you. Alistair was born in April of 1972.
That's correct, yes.
And was there any family history of haemophilia?
No, we had no family history at all.
But when Alistair was in the first year of his life, he was diagnosed with haemophilia, is that right?
That's right, yes, but it was quite some time after he first showed symptoms. But yes, he was diagnosed at about, 10, 11 months. Yeah.
And his haemophilia was severe
Yes.
in nature. He had his first treatment for haemophilia in the form of a whole blood transfusion about the end of 1972.
That's correct, yes.
Can you tell us a little about what Alistair was like as a boy and how his haemophilia affected him?
Well, he was very lively, he was happy. He had principal problems were bleeding into his joints, his elbows. His first bleed was into one of his elbows when he was 3 weeks old, but that wasn't formally diagnosed until much later. Both ankles, both knees. And another problem he had was very severe nosebleeds quite often. But he was happy, and he lived a normal life and went to state school in the community and really had a lovely time most of the time.
And until he was 18, he was under the care of the Royal Manchester Children's Hospital.
That's correct, yes.
But from time to time, he might be treated in Truro Haemophilia Centre when you were on holiday in Cornwall.
Well, that's right, because, of course, because we only had cryoprecipitate, we couldn't carry any stock with us. So holidays, for example, always had to be near a haemophilia centre, and Truro was one of the few that wasn't in the middle of a big city. So we tended to go to Cornwall for our summer holidays because it was easy to access there.
And in 1982, or from 1982, Alistair also received treatment at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre because of particular joint problems he was
That's correct, yes,
experiencing.
yes. He was an inpatient there for approximately 2 weeks in, I think, October, I forgot, and then was much improved, and then went back again in the following January for another couple of weeks. Then was discharged from that centre, yes.
Now, Alistair started off receiving cryoprecipitate.
That's right.
And then in about 1978, 1979 roughly, he started to receive factor VIII concentrates.
That's correct, yes.
And you actually administered treatment to him at home from quite an early stage because you were an anaesthetist by training.
That's right, yes. So we were very lucky, really, that we could go on to home treatment so when he was so young.
And that was from when he was pretty much a toddler onwards?
Well, he was about 18 months, I think, 17 or 18 months, yeah.
Now, in 1976, you and Alistair both developed hepatitis B.
Well, yes, I did clinically, but I didn't know that Alistair had it at the same time, but I was quite ill. And being an anaesthetist, there was a suggestion, which I accepted at the time, that I'd caught the infection, well, been infected in the workplace from either handling blood, doing injections, or from infected patients, and I accepted that at the time. But I've since learnt that Alistair was infected at exactly the same time, and I personally think that it's unlikely that I brought the infection, because as I understand it, the incubation period on average is about 4 months. Now, had I been infected and waited 4 months and infected Alistair, we wouldn't have been infected at the same time, because I'd have been, there'd been too much of a time gap. So I, at the time, thought it was likely that we'd both got the infection from his treatment, or from nosebleeds, or me mopping up his nosebleeds. But the authorities seemed to want to say it was due to my work.
And we'll just have a quick look at those records, Alison, because you've supplied them to the inquiry. Paul, could we have the 05530004, please? And we can see these are some of Alistair's records. We can see, if we just look at the therapeutic materials received in the past, it's about... Oh, I'm sorry, Alison, let me let you get your glasses.
Let me get see. Okay, there we are.
Paul, could you highlight the bit that says therapeutic materials received in the past and the lines under that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is a record from October 1982, and we can see references to Alistair having received, amongst other things, plasma, cryo and whole blood. And then if we go on, please, Paul, to the second page. Thank you. The very bottom 2 lines. We see reference there to 1976 and the hepatitis B antibody positive, and then it says mother, and then we continue on to the next page, please, Paul. Top of the next page. Thank you. First 4 lines. Jaundiced at the same time. She is an anaesthetist and may have got the infection when was HB positive from work. And then if we just have one other document up on screen, please, Paul, it's 05530005. And it's halfway down the page where we have jaundice. So this is a later record, 86, Oxfordshire Area Health Authority, Oxford Haemophilia Centre. Jaundice, 1976, and then it refers to being anti-HBs positive at same time as mother developed B hepatitis. She was working as an anaesthetist at the time. So those are the documents you've drawn to the inquiry's attention, in which there is recorded a suggestion that it may have been your employment that led to the hepatitis B. Yes. You've only realised on seeing these records that yes, Alistair had hepatitis B at exactly the same time.
Yes, I mean, I can't recall him ever being jaundiced, although they've said that. And when you look at that, we're both antigen positive at the same time, which wouldn't fit with the pattern of the disease if it had come from elsewhere. It would only fit with us both being infected at the same time. And fortunately, we both were shown later to have developed antibodies and cleared it all. So, in fact, luckily, we didn't have any chronic hepatitis B as a consequence.
You think it's most likely because you were treating Alistair at home, you were mopping up his nosebleeds on a regular basis. Yeah. You think it most likely that both of you were infected at the same time from the same source of product. Now, when Alistair's treatment switched from the cryoprecipitate to the factor VIII concentrates in the late 1970s, were you given any particular advice or warning or information about any risks of infection?
No.
Were you given any choice about the treatment or which products to use?
No.
In the early years, your statement records that Alistair received products that were almost exclusively BPL products.
That's right, yes.
But then, from about the early 1980s, he was given commercial factor products.
Yes.
And we can see that from a couple of documents. Paul, could we have 05530006, please? We can see this is a letter from the Royal Manchester Children's Hospital dated the 29th of September 1982 to Dr. Ritzer at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. If we could go towards the bottom of the page, the end of the first paragraph. Could you highlight, please, Paul, the last sentence of the first big paragraph? Recent recoveries have shown. So we can see their reference to Alistair receiving Profilate and Coate. And then if we have, please, up on screen 05530007, please, Paul. We can see there this is a hospital treatment record from Oxford. It's dated in October 1982 and then January and February 1983. And we can see Alistair receiving significant quantities of Coate.
Well, and the other thing I would say about that, I mean, the first lot, I can't see the second part, but they're all the same batch numbers, those. And the second admission, those were both when he was admitted in Oxford. Mm.
So he was receiving batch 8368 in the October admission, and then a batch number 8413 in the early 1983 admission.
That's right.
Were you given any particular information about that product or any product inserts, leaflets about it?
I mean, because obviously Alistair was actually in Oxford. We couldn't stay in Oxford. We had to go back home to work. So we only saw him at weekend, and we knew that he was having prophylaxis, but we didn't know for the physiotherapy, but we didn't know what was being used or anything of that sort of nature, and it was never discussed.
And a little later on, after heat-treated products were introduced, if we have up on screen 05530008, please, Paul. These are records from 1986. And if we just go down towards the last entry that you can see currently on the screen, we can see Alistair receiving 8Y, but then moving on to receiving haemophil. Again, was that something that was ever discussed with you or brought to your attention?
No, not really. I mean, I have to say, by then, we already knew his HIV status, but not his Hep C status. And in the main, we had asked for him to have British-produced products. But when we went to collect it, you got what you were given, really. You hadn't any choice. And at that time, they chose to use haemophil, which was very suspect, I think. Although he was already HIV positive at that stage, but it may have a bearing on his hepatitis C.
You've a recollection that you describe in your witness statement of a television programme showing the horrors of pooled plasma products, is the way you put it. What can you recall about that?
I remember, I know it was a World in Action programme, I think, and I believe that it had actually been broadcast previously, but this was probably late 1980, I can't remember precisely. And we were members of the North West Haemophilia Group at that time, and they sort of published that it was going to be shown, and we watched it, and it was awful, really, about people, paid American drug addicts and prisoners, and the pooling of pointing out how dangerous it was to have such huge pools of plasma. So really, the Haemophilia Society tried to, petitioned for the Manchester Health Authority to provide product from Elstree, and we also went to see our MP. And he actually asked a question in the House of Commons, but nobody took any notice. They just continued to provide whatever they chose, mainly American Factor 8.
Now, in around November 1984, Alistair was unwell. He had a raised temperature, swollen glands and lethargy. And you went to your regular quarterly clinic.
That's right.
Was anything particular said about his state of health at that stage?
No, not really. I mean, we went to we went to review clinics every quarter where they did. We saw the dentist and the physicians and physiotherapists and so on, and they took bloods from him, but nobody, A, told us what the bloods were that they were being taken, and B, discussed his general state of health at that time.
And you yourself then developed non-A, non-B hepatitis, as
That's
hepatitis
right.
C was then known, in early 1985. What can you recall about that?
Well, I just remember I was at work and I felt very ill, and felt that I'd felt exactly as horribly as I'd felt when I'd had hepatitis previous to Hep B. So I went to the doctor, who again agreed. I wasn't jaundiced at all, but the most noticeable thing was a complete lack of any interest in food at all. And the doctor diagnosed what they called then non-A, non-B hepatitis. And to my mind, that was only a matter of weeks after Alison had been unwell. And again, for the same reasons, I think it's very likely that we'd both got hepatitis. Well, I didn't know that he had hepatitis C then. But with hindsight, seeing these recent records, I think, again, it's likely that we'd acquired the infection from the same source, which was the blood product.
Now, on the 28th of August 1985, you were sent a letter, 0553002, please, Paul. And we can see it's a letter from Dr. Evans at the Royal Manchester Children's Hospital, 24th of August 85. And it says this: "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, we've been sending blood samples away from the children with haemophilia and similar diseases to see if they're at risk of AIDS. None of our patients has developed AIDS or has shown any signs of doing so, but all of us, both parents and staff, are anxious about the problem. The results are now coming through." Just pausing there, were you aware that Alistair was being tested for what's referred to here as AIDS, but for HTLV3?
No, as I said earlier, we knew bloods were being taken, but we thought they were for inhibitors or anemia or routine things. No one actually mentioned that they were doing HIV testing. In fact, I think at that time it had only been available for a matter of months. But no, it wasn't discussed.
And then if we continue with the letter, the blood tests on your child Alistair show that he is positive for antibodies to HTLV3, i.e. it means that he's been exposed to the AIDS virus sometime in the past. It does not mean that he has AIDS, but there is a small chance that he may get it. We will have to wait quite a long time before we can tell if anything will develop.
That's right.
It is only a small number of patients who show this blood change who actually go on to develop AIDS. Of the first 16 patients we have tested, over 60% have given a positive result. Nearly all of them have been treated with the old factor VIII concentrates made in the USA. And then the letter continues: "I know that this is worrying news for you. If you would like to come and see us for a further chat about it, please let Sister Shaw know. We will set some time aside to discuss things with you. But don't forget that the positive blood test only indicates past exposure to the virus. It does not mean that the disease is bound to appear." Now, this letter came essentially out of the blue without any warning.
That's right, yes.
And that was the sum total, apart from a leaflet we'll come on to, it was the sum total of the information that you were initially provided with.
Yes.
I understand that you don't personally criticise Dr. Evans.
No.
But do you have any views about how the information about Alice's diagnosis was given to you?
Well, it would have been much more sympathetic to actually interview us, really. And, I mean, we were aware from the newspapers and literature, we were aware that AIDS was a problem cropping up in the USA. So we knew that it was quite likely that Alistair would in the future be affected in that way. But I think it would have been better if we'd actually been given an appointment and gone and talked about it.
And the other document that you were given is at 0553010, and it was part of a pamphlet about AIDS published by the DHSS for doctors, May 1985. It says guidance on measures to control spread. This guidance is not only for patients with AIDS and their families and friends, but also for persons with positive HTLV3 antibody tests and members of the risk groups shown in the table. And then it talks about transmission by sexual intercourse or by transfusion or inoculation of blood or blood products. And then it goes on to talk about the risk of infecting others through sexual relationships, about the kind of contact that should be avoided, about sharing of needles and syringes. Now, how old was Alistair at the time of his diagnosis?
13.
And you have views about the appropriateness of this being the information that was provided for you to share with Alistair?
Well, yes, I think that's totally inappropriate. The whole thing, I mean, the rest of it's pretty awful too. It's totally inappropriate to think that we could discuss any of that with a boy of 13.
Were you given any other information about the condition or its likely progress or prognosis? No. And can you recall whether you did go in and see the nursing sister or Dr. Evans to discuss Alistair's condition at that time?
I don't think we did. I can't remember, but I don't think we did because, to be honest, I don't know that I didn't feel that they would know much, be able to give us any better advice than what I knew from my work and from newspapers and literature.
You have expressed a concern in your statement about the prioritisation for the testing. You were led to believe that the testing of Alistair and other children took place only after the tests had been done for professionals involved in,
That's right.
in emergency services.
We were told, I mean, I don't know when this blood sample was taken. It was probably at one of the quarterly review clinics, but we were told after the result had come back, that they couldn't get, I think the test had been available from early that year, in 1985, but I'm not certain of that. And we were told that people like the police, paramedics, ambulance service, all felt that they were much more important and were clamouring to have the test done, so that the people who were most likely to be affected were not actually, I mean, in hindsight, it wouldn't have made the scrap of difference, but it just seemed unreasonable to postpone testing of the ill, potentially ill boys and not and pander to the groups that I've mentioned.
How and when did you tell Alistair about the diagnosis?
Probably when he was about 14. And I think that when he was attending the clinics, the haemophilia nurses, who were very good, also talked to him about it too.
And how did he react as a 14-year-old boy being given this information?
Well, he was very upset. He learned that he had a potentially fatal, untreatable condition, and it manifested really in those early years when he was 14, 15, 16. He was hugely angry a lot of the time, although very happy in between times, but and not surprisingly, he was extremely angry.
And you've also said in your statement that he became increasingly distressed.
Well, yes.
Oh.
Yes, he did.
He managed, despite the diagnosis and the reaction that you've explained it engendered in him, he managed to complete his ONA levels.
That's right.
And he won a place at Newcastle University.
That's great, yeah.
What course was he going to study?
It was electronic and electrical engineering.
And we've got a photo of Alistair from around this time. Paul, it's 553011. If we just have it slightly larger, thank you. That's your favourite photograph of Alistair, I understand. And that's with the car that he and Joanne
That's right, yeah.
were able to drive. And it's about the time he was going off to university.
Well, yeah, that would be when he'd finished sixth form and was waiting for his results, and then shortly after that he went up to Newcastle.
And it was for the purpose of enrolling in his university course in Newcastle that he was sent to the Newcastle Haemophilia Centre for his haemophilia care.
Yes, well, you see, he'd remained at the Manchester Children's Hospital, although he was by then 18, until his results were known, and he was going up to Newcastle, and then he was re-registered. He was registered, instead of being registered in Manchester, he then registered in Newcastle at the Royal Victoria Infirmary.
And he went for a routine appointment there, and that's where he learnt that he'd also been infected with hepatitis C.
Yes.
And that visit also revealed his immunity was considerably impaired and his CD4 count was very low.
Yes.
And you've observed in your statement that he not long before that had an appointment at Manchester and none of those matters have been discussed.
That's right. And I must say, you see, he'd gone up to Newcastle, we'd taken him up to Newcastle and he'd settled in and been to this haemophilia centre, and then he rang up and said, oh, Dr. Hamilton, I think he was named, would like to meet you. And I thought, how nice for them to be telling us. So I drove up to Newcastle, which was 3.5 hours. Met up with Alistair at lunchtime, and then he'd lectures in the afternoon. He was happy as anything. And I went to the haemophilia centre and met Dr. Hamilton, only to be told, really, that he was quite advanced immune suppression, compromise.
Alistair's health deteriorated during his time at Newcastle University.
That's right, yeah.
He lost weight, he became increasingly fatigued, and he was very vulnerable to infections.
Well, that's right. His particular pattern of disease was that he kept getting staphylococcal septicemia, which is what they call sepsis now. So he'd have to go into hospital. They'd give him pretty hefty intravenous antibiotics, heart support and all those things that you have to do. And then, so it would be a number of weeks, then he'd get a bit better, and then he'd come back out. But it's happened often and increasingly frequently. But in between times, he enjoyed his course, I think, and being a student.
But he was too ill to sit his final exams.
That's right, yes. By then he was, yeah.
And so you took him home back to live with you, and he was also receiving care at that stage from the Royal University Hospital in Liverpool.
Yes, that's right.
Did Alistair and indeed you and the rest of the family feel able to tell family members and friends about his condition?
Well, I did. I don't know about Joanne, but my husband certainly didn't. He was very, very upset, and he wouldn't tell his mother. He told his mother about a fortnight before Alistair died. I'm sure she probably guessed, but he just wouldn't discuss it with anybody.
And you had, I think, in the early years, one instance of neighbours whose children had been friends with your children, and when they learnt of Alistair's diagnosis, they cut off contact.
That's right, absolutely, yes.
Did Alistair experience any stigma or difficulties when he was trying to access medical care?
Well, yeah, there were two occasions. One was when he was in sixth form at school. He'd foolishly jumped down a short flight of three or four steps. And when he jumped up, he hit the top of his head on the beam that was supporting the equivalent steps above. And he got a very tense blood stain, a blood cyst on the top of his head, and the skin was looking as though it might actually necrose. So we gave him lots of factor 8 and then took him to the local hospital just to ask them if they would take the tension out of it with a needle aspiration. So we just went to A&E locally and felt obliged to mention to the doctor that he was HIV positive, so whereupon the doctor put on a giant plastic apron, some gloves, rubber gloves that were, well, I've described it as like a vet might use to examine a cow, drew the curtains round, which they tend to do in hospitals, but then started just announcing in a very loud voice about HIV and how he'd caught it, and which of course was audible to everybody else, and we just found it was totally unsuitable, really.
And then there was another instance when Alistair experienced an adverse reaction when you were asking for assistance. He loved music and going to
That's
raves
right.
and festivals.
Yeah, well, this was when he was at university. I think it was probably about 1992. He and his friend had managed to get tickets for Glastonbury. Now, he'd been ill quite a bit before then, on and off, but he was quite well at the moment. And I thought, well, I'll write that to the medical officer in charge of care facilities at Glastonbury, because I did know, I'd found that they actually had a medical centre, with a brick-built medical centre with proper flush toilets. And I thought, I wrote asking, could he use the flush toilets rather than the unsavoury toilets they tend to have at festival sites. And we just got a letter back saying, no, he can't. He shouldn't come. And I just thought that was disgraceful, really. He did go.
He did go, and you rented a hotel room in Glastonbury so
That's
that he
right.
could come to use the facilities and have a rest, but then go back and enjoy the rest of the festival.
That's right, yes.
How were the last couple of years of Alistair's life in terms of his health and his ability to do anything?
Well, the pattern carried on, but by then he was having not only MRSA, but septicemia intermittently. He had sort of systemic fungal infections, which made him very unwell. So he was just getting weaker and more frail and more frequently ill in hospital. I mean, he spent his 21st birthday in hospital. And lots of friends used to come and visit him, but he wasn't strong as he had been, although he still enjoyed himself. And then finally, he'd been ill for a number of weeks before Christmas, and we'd managed to get him back out from Liverpool that he was in then. But we had to give him intravenous antibiotics at home, which we were doing. And then just after Christmas, I can remember my sister and her husband and their 2 children, who were similar ages to ours, they lived in Yorkshire. They'd come over just to see him. I mean, it was obvious by then that that was potentially going to be the last time they could see him. And it turned out that he had C. diff and had a massive fresh bleed from his bowel as a result of the enterocolitis. So we gave him as much Factor 8 as we could, rang Liverpool and called the paramedics, and they came round. Resuscitated him, actually gave him drips and so on, and then we had to go to Liverpool in the ambulance, and he stayed in Liverpool there until he died at the end of that month.
And he died on the 31st of January
That's
1995. Right. And how old was Alistair?
22.
You have a particular concern about Alistair's death certificate.
I do, yes.
Paul, could we have 0553009, please? We can see the causes of death there given: septicemia, bronchopneumonia, and then 2, haemophilia. So no reference to HIV or AIDS. What is it that concerns you about the death certificate?
Well, as far as I am aware, a death certificate part 1 should include the things that actually caused the death. Now, I don't believe he had bronchopneumonia, although he may have done. He was unconscious for a week before he actually finally died. As I've described to you, his actual immediate cause was his C. diff and low blood pressure from blood loss, and also septicemia. I mean, I agree with the septicemia, but he'd gone into acute he'd got renal failure, really, and fundamentally that was a consequence of HIV/AIDS and immunosuppression due to HIV/AIDS, and I think that should have shown on there. I mean, I agree haemophilia was correct at part 2, but I think that to my mind, that is trying to obscure the fact that the main cause of death was HIV/AIDS.
And you've expressed the particular concern in your statement as
Yeah.
to how there can be reliable information about the extent of what was happening
Well,
if
that's
the
right.
death certificate doesn't accurately record the true cause of Alistair's death.
That's true, yes. I mean, you listen, when you look in the press, even now they're saying they don't quite know how many people were affected. Well, if they'd been certifying the death certificates properly, they'd have a much better idea. I mean, I appreciate that some people didn't want it on the death certificate, although this was a little bit, and that was more so a little bit earlier. I don't blame, I suspect that the junior doctors who do the certificates were being pressured by somebody else not to let it be known. I can't prove that, but that's just my gut feeling that there was a genuine attempt to obscure what had happened.
Can I ask you, Alison, a little about the impact on you and on the family of Alistair's illness and his death at such a young age? You gave up your career as an anaesthetist
That's
to
right.
look after him, and you instead worked for the DHSS
That's right.
war pension so that
Yeah,
you could have the time when he needed you to be with him and care for him.
that's right. I realised as soon as we got the diagnosis, that was back in 1985. Now, I'd been off ill anyway with Hep C, or what subsequently was shown to be Hep C. And then we got the letter, and from my knowledge, I knew that it was very likely that in the future he was going to be very ill. And I wanted to help look after him, and I didn't think it was reasonable to continue in clinical medicine. And then just announced one day, I can't come in today because I'm going to look after my sick son. So I actually changed careers then deliberately to put into something that was non-clinical so that I did have the facility to look after him as and when the time arose.
You again say in your statement that you think Alistair's death contributed to the breakup of your marriage.
Yes, I'm sure it did.
Uh,
My husband, as I've mentioned earlier, was very upset by it all. And the other thing was, I suspect to his mind, I was the person who'd given Alistair haemophilia. Therefore, it was my fault. I think that's not an uncommon finding in haemophiliac families, really.
And you'd lost your son and Joanne, her little brother.
That's right.
Alistair received a payment from the Macfarlane Trust during his lifetime.
That's right, yes.
£20,000.
That's right.
But nothing else in
No.
his lifetime. And you've said in your statement that he had to give up all opportunity to claim for any other compensation in the future.
That was a requirement of accepting the money from the Macfarlane Trust, which was purported to be a no-fault compensation scheme, that they had to actually sign that you wouldn't sue for anything else, no matter what arose. And as time goes by, it became obvious that that was hepatitis B and hepatitis C in addition to HIV. The other thing that upset me really was, I mean, as I've mentioned, we were lucky, in a way lucky, in that he happened just to have turned 16 when the mass action was proposed, and because he was 16, he could apply for legal aid, because there was always a risk that you might be required to pay legal fees or the costs of the action. That was one potential outcome, and he could apply for legal aid, so that was not a worry to us. All we had to pay was a small amount of money as his, what they call, best friend. But then, because he was young, he got £20,000, which I always thought was... I mean, I appreciate that people with families and spouses and families would merit more because they're. But just being under 21 seemed to be very poor value on life, really. And I think for people with even younger children, I think their awards were very, very small, which just seemed to be an inappropriate valuation of somebody's life. And a person of Alistair's age, 22, should reasonably have been able to expect to have a potential wife or family or in the future, and I didn't see why they thought he was less valuable because he happened to be younger.
You've said in your statement, based upon your medical training, you've said this: it was well recognised from the late 1960s or early 1970s that use of pooled plasma significantly increased the risk of transmission of virus infections, notably HBV. I knew this from my medical training and cannot understand how the NHS sanctioned the purchase of American Factor VIII and denied that there was an increased risk.
That's absolutely right, yes.
So based upon your own knowledge from your training. Alison, those are the questions I have for you, but is there anything else that you would like to add?
Well, I mean, I must say, it's done now, you can't get out of it, but when he was first diagnosed, I was relieved because I had thought he'd had a big swollen elbow, was bruised and anaemic, and I thought he had some horrible, fatal childhood disease. So when they told us he had haemophilia, we were actually quite relieved because at least it was something that was treatment available. And then we felt we were lucky when we could get home treatment. We were even more lucky when we got the factor, the blood products, the concentrate, because that gave us a great deal more freedom as to where we could go and what we could do. And then from feeling that we were actually managing things very well, I feel, as time went by, I began to feel that particularly the government thought it was almost as if there's only 4,000 haemophiliacs. It's expensive to improve the blood place at Elstree, which, I mean, fortunately, I didn't know how awful it was until much later. And I felt there was a sort of political, I suspect there was a political decision that we won't bother with those people. We'll spend our money on something else and not do this. We'll get the stuff from America, it's cheaper. But I mean, that's just my feeling. And that was that over time, as time went by, that there were a lot of uncaring. And some of the comments from various Ministers of Health really were not appropriate, I don't think. But that's all I have to say, really.
Thank you very much, Alison. Sir, do you have any questions?
Well, I do, yes. Can we go back, please, Paul, to 002? Now, this is the letter which came to you in August 1985 from Dr. Evans.
That's right.
And as I look at it, the inference might be drawn that it was a pro forma letter where the name of the parents and the name of the child were filled in.
That's right, yes, I'm sure that was the case.
So there would have been a number of such letters.
Yes.
This was, by inference again, therefore, a test or set of tests on parents which parents were being informed about for the first time, as one reads the first paragraph, none of them having known anything about it before.
That's right, yes.
Since this was plainly systematic, was anything other than what is said in the last paragraph offered by way of counselling?
Well, only that it said somewhere that we could actually, if we wanted to talk about it, we could make an appointment. But no, not formally as such, no.
Yes, thank you.
And so we have seen a not dissimilar pro forma letter from the same hospital in relation to a witness in Leeds in which the result was a negative result, you may recall.
Do we yet know how many children were involved?
Other than the information that's given here about the first 16 patients and over 60% given a positive result, not yet, so no.
And do we yet know how much effort went into drafting what was plainly a pro forma letter delivering life-changing news?
We don't at the moment, so no. Those inquiries are ongoing.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Alison, for coming to tell us about your own infection, which you've played down, and about Alistair's, which you've told us about, and giving us the benefit of your experience as a former anaesthetist. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll take a break, Ms. Richards, until 11:30.
Yes, sir.
11:30.